This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you episode 49 of Season 3 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, December 3rd, 1910, and I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford that week. The week starts with the Westford Center section. Miss Layton, who was substituting at the library for Miss Bunce, had a disagreeable and unusual experience at the library one evening last week. A man who was badly intoxicated got off the car, that is the trolley that used to run up to Westford Center, the car that arrived shortly after 6 and gravitated to the brightly lighted building. After stumbling about in a way that endangered the fine old tall clock and the statuary in the conversation room, he settled down on a settee, from which later police officer John Feeney removed him. He proved to be a farmhand employed by one of our farmers outside the village. John S. Grieg, who happened to be on hand, assisted Mr. Feeney and took him to his place of employment with his fast-driving horse. Reverend William C. H. Moe of West Chelmsford Methodist Episcopal Church preached most acceptably at the Congregational Church last Sunday morning in exchange with Mr. Wallace. Next Sunday evening at the Congregational Church, there will be a Union Temperance service. The church, uniting with Graniteville Methodist Church, Reverend Mr. Lewis Havermel, who was the pastor of the Methodist Church, will be the speaker of the evening. The service will be at 7:30. The various committees are busy preparing for their annual church banquet at the Congregational Church on Wednesday evening, December 14th. A good list of speakers is being arranged for. The ladies are having a dumbwaiter installed, which, with the kitchen upstairs, will greatly facilitate the serving of refreshments downstairs. Among those who have had fall shingling done are the homes of Mrs. Noah Prescott, she lived at 23 Boston Road, Mrs. Nelson Tuttle, 14 Boston Road, Wright and Fletcher Store, now Muffins and Main, at 40 Main Street, and the Isaac Day House at 16 Main Street, owned by George T. Day. John S. Grieg has recently received his diploma as undertaker and embalmer from the New England Institute of Anatomy, Boston. John's father, David Grieg, was an undertaker working from his Fairview farm located across Main Street from Fairview Cemetery. And John was joining his father, David, in the undertaking business. Mr. and Mrs. Charles Howard had at their Thanksgiving gathering Mr. and Mrs. Charles Howard and son, John from Concord, New Hampshire, Mr. and Mrs. George Howard, and Miss Alice Howard from Cotuit. Mrs. Rachel Reed is staying with her daughter, Mrs. H.V. Hildreth. Among minor improvements noted around the common is the raking of the common itself of leaves, new planking of the platform for the scales near J. H. Fletcher's store, that was on Lincoln Street, now Connolly Insurance, and new flooring of the old store piazza where the teams load for market during the summer. The next section is about the Tadmuck Club, the ladies' club at Westford Center. A most enjoyable and interesting meeting of the Tadmuck Club took place on Tuesday afternoon at the Congregational Vestry. This change of meeting place was for the use of the piano for the musical part of the program. It was very much regretted that the storm and the execrable walking made it possible for only a comparatively small number to attend. Miss Edith Foster had charge of the afternoon with a talk titled Cuba and Her Neighbors Under Spanish and American Rule as the subject. Miss Forster gave an excellent paper, well delivered, and full of research concerning Haiti, which is spelled Hayti, Haiti, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, and Cuba, giving special attention to this latter and drawing a faithful portrayal of its turbulent history. The afternoon's program was supplemented with some musical numbers of unusual excellence. These artists were Mrs. Oliver W. Priest of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, contralto, Miss Laura R. Herrig of Pepperell, violinist, Leo C. Thayer of Pepperell, clarinetist, and Miss E. Marion Sweat, accompanist. Mrs. Priest, who won so many friends last season with her rich contralto voice and pleasing personality, was enjoyed fully as much in her selection on Tuesday. Miss Herrig and Mr. Thayer are both experienced in orchestral work and are most skillful musicians, and Miss Sweat's work as an accompanist always is thoroughly enjoyed by the club. The next meeting will be in the library hall at 3 o'clock, and the general subject will be continued, the special topic being Louisiana. Miss Clara A. Smith, chairman. Next is the About Town section. If distance lends enchantment, it also frequently lends disappointment. Such proved to be the result of the plans for the dedication of the memorial window for the Unitarian Church, which had all reasonable expectation of being carried out when the day arrived, planned for last Sunday. The day arrived on time, but the window did not. This resulted in canceling the memorial exercises for the date assigned. The window arrived on Wednesday morning, November 30th, having been 11 days coming from New York City. There are no people to blame in the old First Parish Church for the delay and postponement. The new date for memorial has not been dealt out. Turns out it was the following Sunday. The new house of Councilor Herbert E. Fletcher on Oak Hill is nearing completion. It is all Oak Hill granite of varied color. We'll have an elevator from cellar to attic and automatic duster. When finished, it will be a gem of convenience and beauty. It is not expected to be ready for service before the time when the poet and nature sing, "Oh, what is so rare as a day in June." That quote is the first line of an untitled sonnet by the American poet James Russell Lowell. And the house referred to is still near the quarries off Groton Road at the Oak Hill Quarry, and is still quite impressive. The Boston and Maine, alias the Hartford and New Haven Railroad, its older name, have commenced driving piling in the Stony Brook to widen the railroad bridge between Westford Station and the Stone Arch Bridge at Graniteville. This is necessary as part of the plan to lengthen the sidetrack at Westford Station. Deer have been seen feeding on the green rye on the Cold Spring Farm, that's on Main Street at Cold Spring Road. Their sense of scent is keen. John S. Grieg has got his diploma as undertaker and embalmer from the New England Institute of Anatomy at Boston. John is right, bright, and genial, and ready to take hold if anyone is anxious. Since he worked at a funeral home, I don't think too many people were anxious. The First Parish Church was well represented last Sunday afternoon at the installation of Reverend O.J. Fairfield at Littleton. The snowstorm excommunicated all communication by telephone, and news has to be dug off face to face. It is expected that the next meeting of the Fortnightly Club will be held Friday evening, December 9th, at the Old Stand, the Wright Schoolhouse on Concord Road. This is the time schedule long established by the Fortnightly Club, as the name suggests, if it is not quite true to name on the above date. Don't make up faces at the writer, but at the telephone, which at the present time will neither speak nor be spoken to. The season for Farmers' Institutes has arrived, snow and all, and the electric cars will pass our town hall doors all winter. Shall we open them to an institute? They liked Westford environments and viands. The next section is the Graniteville section. The mills of the Abbott Worston Company and Charles G. Sargent's machine shop that were closed for the Thanksgiving holidays resumed operation again on Monday morning at the usual hour. All the schools in the village were open again on Monday after the brief Thanksgiving vacation. Mr. and Mrs. Timothy Sullivan of Marlborough have been recent guests of Mr. and Mrs. John A. Healy in this village. Miss Mary J. Sullivan of this village has recently returned from a brief visit spent with friends at East Pepperell. Mr. and Mrs. George L. Gilson and family have moved into their new residence on 4th Street. Mrs. Harris and daughter, Miss Ethel, are visiting friends in Lowell. Miss Rachel Wall and Master Raymond Master Raymond Wall spent the Thanksgiving holidays as the guests of Mr. and Mrs. Frank D. Riney of Lowell. Mr. and Mrs. George Day of Damariscotta, Maine, are the guests of Dr. and Mrs. W.H. Sherman of this village. Mr. and Mrs. Fred Provost have recently returned from a part business and pleasure trip in Providence. Mr. and Mrs. John B. Carmichael spent the holidays with friends at Mr. Carmichael's boyhood home in Wilton, New Hampshire. Charles Couture has the foundation laid preparatory to erecting a 2-tenement house in the early spring. The site is an ideal one situated near Mr. Couture's home on Main Street. Cameron Circle, C of FA, that's Companions of Foresters of America, are planning on a class initiation in January. The members are busy getting new members to join and have already succeeded in bringing in quite a large number. The Grand Chief Companion, Miss Julia McCarthy, will initiate the new members, assisted by Grand Supreme Supervisor of Laws, Mrs. Evelyn Sawyer of Boston, and Grand Financial Secretary, Mrs. Virginia Moriarty of Worcester. Reverend Father O'Neill, High Court Chaplain of the Massachusetts Catholic Order of Foresters, has appointed Reverend Edmund Schofield, pastor of St. Catherine's Church, as chaplain of Court Westford. He will be present at the first meeting in September, and it is hoped that all the members will attend the meeting to receive him. Mr. and Mrs. Hyacinth Leduc have gone to Camden, New Jersey for a few weeks to visit their daughter. That was Mary Louisa Leduc, and son-in-law, Mr. and Mrs. Timothy A. Riney, who recently moved there from this village, where Mr. Riney holds a lucrative position. Next, we come to the Forge Village section. A musicale, which was very well attended, was held at the home of Mrs. Dinah McMurray, née Baker, on Pleasant Street on Friday evening, November 26th. At the conclusion of the entertainment, a most enjoyable supper was served by the hostess, Mrs. McMurray, assisted by her sister, Mrs. Friedrich Davis. The merry party broke up at a late hour and hope that another meeting may be held in the near future. The Groton School Orchestra, under the direction of Mr. Griswold, held its annual concert in Recreation Hall on Saturday evening, November 26th at 8 o'clock, before a large and very appreciative audience. There were many present from Ayer, Groton, and Graniteville, among whom was a delegation from the Epworth League, connected with the Graniteville Methodist Episcopal Church. The proceeds of the concert will be used for the benefit of St. Andrew's Mission. The Abbott Worsted Company resumed work at the usual hour on Monday morning after the holidays. Cameron School also opened on that day after the Thanksgiving vacation. Mr. and Mrs. Fenimore Morton of Central, now West Prescott Street, are entertaining Miss Sarah Northrup of Pepperell, a sister of Mrs. Morton. Mr. and Mrs. John E. Burnett spent Saturday and Sunday as guests of Mr. and Mrs. Chester Blodgett of the Ridges. Mrs. William Burnett spent Saturday in Lawrence visiting Mr. and Mrs. Teal. Mrs. Teal has recently returned from California and had a box of fresh fruits and nuts awaiting Mrs. Burnett, a rare treat at this season of the year. Miss Christine Lowther and her nieces, the Mrs. May and Annie Cherry, returned Sunday after a most enjoyable visit with their sister and aunt, Miss Catherine Lowther of Andover, over the Thanksgiving holiday. Miss Edith Precious was the guest over Thanksgiving of her sister and brother-in-law, Mr. and Mrs. Michael Keefe of Townsend Harbor, both formerly of this village. Beginning Wednesday, November 30th, and until further notice, the Ladies' Sewing Circle will meet on Wednesday afternoon at 2:30 instead of on Thursdays as formerly. Services at the Mission will be held at 4:15 p.m. Sunday, as announced last week. The Polish woman who sustained a painful injury while at work in the Abbott Worsted Company's mill last week is now about and hopes for a complete recovery soon. And 1910 was the early era of Polish and Russian immigration to Westford, mostly of people who worked in the mills. The Wardsman correspondents often omitted their unfamiliar names when they made news, as we see here. Next, we have a section called Holiday Guests. Thanksgiving Day was passed very quietly in the village this year. At many of the homes, family reunions were held, while other families spent the holiday out of town. There were quite a few visitors noted, however. At the home of Mr. and Mrs. William Burnett on Pleasant Street, Mrs. R.E. Longbottom, she was a daughter of the Burnetts, Polly, and little son William of Arlington Heights, and Mrs. John H. Jones. She was also another daughter, Laura Burnett, and daughter were entertained. Mr. and Mrs. James Wilson had at their Thanksgiving dinner, besides their daughter and son-in-law, Mr. and Mrs. George Weaver Jr. and little son Malcolm, the following young people: Timothy Sullivan of Manchester, New Hampshire, the Mrs. Mamie and Agnes Sullivan of Nashua, New Hampshire, and Miss Abby M. Blaisdell of Wamosett. Robert McCardle of Manchester, New Hampshire, spent the holiday at the home of his daughter and son-in-law, Mr. and Mrs. John E. Burnett. A very pleasant family reunion occurred at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Frederick Davis on Pleasant Street on Thanksgiving Day. About 15 sat down to a bountiful dinner, and the evening was spent in song and music. Next, there's an article about a wedding. The home of Mr. and Mrs. Fenimore Morton on Central Street was the scene Thanksgiving Day of a very pretty wedding when Miss Rose Ella Northrop, a sister of Mrs. Morton and one of the most popular of the village young people, became the bride of John Morton, a well-known young man of Lowell. The ceremony was performed by Reverend Louis Havermale of the Methodist Episcopal Church at Graniteville, of which both young people are members. At 4 o'clock, the bridal party entered the parlor to Wagner's Wedding March, played by Miss Emily Catchpole of this village and an intimate friend of the bride. Miss Hattie Northrop, a sister of the bride, was bridesmaid, and a brother of the groom, Fenimore Morton, acted as best man. After the ceremony, a wedding supper was served to members of the family and near relations. Later in the evening, amid showers of rice and with the best wishes of all present, the happy couple left on a short wedding trip. Upon their return, Mr. and Mrs. Norton will be glad to receive their friends at their new home, 15 Westford Street, Lowell. There was a display of many useful as well as many valuable wedding gifts. That's the news in Westford for the week ending December 3rd, 1910. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Ryan Cousins of Westford Cat for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Wardsman at our website at museum.westford.org or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from days gone by. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.